In this explainer, we're diving into a specific text from the Seerah, which is the prophetic biography. We're going to see how this one source builds up this idea of divine guidance, and then flips the script to explain why, from its perspective, that guidance was ultimately rejected.
So the text we're looking at kicks off with this really powerful quote from Aisha, the prophet's wife. And the big idea here isn't just that he followed the scripture. No, it's that his character was the scripture, walking and talking.
Okay, so how does the source break this down? Well, it starts by laying out what it calls 4 key blessings, or you could call them core functions, that were delivered through the Prophet Muhammad. Think of these as the absolute bedrock of his guidance.
And here they are. First, reciting the verses. Second, sanctifying the people. Third, teaching the book and the wisdom. And finally, teaching what people just didn't know before. Now the text is really clear on this. These aren't just 4 separate jobs on a checklist. Nope. It frames them as one big connected process, a kind of spiritual transformation.
So the source really wants us to see the connection between those first 2 points. It says, just reciting the verses, that wasn't the whole picture. The prophet's own character, his example, was the lesson in how to purify yourself. It was all about sanctification. He didn't just talk the talk, he literally walked the walk.
Okay, this next part is super interesting. Remember step 3, teaching the book and the wisdom. Now, the book, that's pretty straightforward. It's the Qur'an. But what about the wisdom, or hikmah as it's called? Well, according to this text, that's the sunnah.
So what exactly is the sunnah? Well, this source tells us it's everything. The prophet's practices, his legal rulings, the whole shebang. It's basically the practical how-to manual for living out the Qur'an's principles every single day. It's not just wisdom on a page, it's wisdom in action.
And you see how this all circles back to that quote we started with? It brings us right back to this central idea of the prophet as a walking Qur'an. The divine text wasn't just something to be read, it was something to be lived.
This really drives the point home. The text describes how the companions would hear a verse, and then they could just look over at the prophet and see that verse in action, right there in front of them. It's like his life was the ultimate living commentary on the scripture.
Okay, so we've talked about the prophet. Now the text kind of zooms out and looks at the bigger picture, the community, the people who followed him, and is really specific that they weren't just supposed to sit back and receive this guidance. Oh no, they had a very active role to play. The author points to this specific verse to lay out that role. It says the community's job is to be a witness for all of humanity. And how do they do that? By actively promoting what's right, ma'ruf, and forbidding what's wrong, al-munkar, according to the text's definitions, of course.
So right there, a clear standard is set. You have the ideal way to believe and act. And then the text makes a sharp turn. It asks, okay, but what happens when a group gets this guidance and just doesn't follow it? This question is the springboard into a really detailed analysis of another community.
This is where the source gets very specific. It has a whole section titled, A Description of the Jews in the Noble Qur'an. And it's super important to be clear here. What we're about to go through is the specific viewpoint, the specific claims coming directly from this text.
And let me just double down on that. What's coming up is reported straight from our source. This isn't a general view. It is one text interpretation of Scripture, compiling a list of characteristics it attributes to the Jewish people. This whole process, defining yourself by defining others, is a really key way that religious traditions have historically drawn their own boundaries.
So what the author does is they put together this list of 10 very specific characteristics. And the argument is that this list comes straight out of the Qur'an and the Sunnah. So let's take a look at the list exactly as it's presented in the source.
So here they are. And as you can see, it's a mix of things. Some are big theological claims, like associating partners with God, and others are behavioral traits, like hypocrisy or jealousy. Now, it's worth noting that creating a fixed list of negative traits and pinning it on an entire group, well, that's a classic rhetorical move you see in these kinds of argumentative texts. The source then tries to back up every single one of these points with verses from Scripture.
To get a feel for how the author builds their case, let's just zoom in on one of these. Let's take number 8, not benefiting from knowledge. To make this point, the text uses a really vivid comparison straight from the Qur'an.
This verse is presented as Exhibit A. The argument is pretty clear, right? Having sacred books like the Torah is useless if you don't actually apply what's in them. The text uses this powerful image of a donkey loaded up with books it can't read to make that point. All right, let's look at one more example to see the method. Point number 3, hiding knowledge and distorting facts.
This time, instead of a metaphor, the author points to what they claim is a specific historical event to prove their point.
So, the story goes like this. According to the source, the children of Israel were told to say one word, hita, which means forgive us. But, the text claims, they deliberately and mockingly changed it to something that sounds similar but means something completely different and nonsensical, a grain in barley. For the author, this isn't a metaphor. It's presented as literal, historical proof of distortion.
So you see the bigger picture here? The narrative arc the text is building? First, it sets up the ideal, the prophet and his community, the perfect example of guidance. Then, it lays out this long list of negative traits, pins them on another community, and uses that as the reason, the explanation for why the prophet's message was met with so much resistance.
When you step back, what this analysis really shows is a powerful dynamic at play inside the source text. You can see how an identity is forged for one community, an identity of guidance, of being a witness, by creating this very different, very negative identity for another group as a contrast. And that leaves us with a really big question to think about. How do powerful stories like this one, these foundational texts, go on to shape how a community sees itself and how it sees others for generations, even centuries?